In space technology, the line between success and failure is a very thin one.
Delayed for 6 months because Russia couldn't complete a part it's carrying for the International Space Station. But now the countdown's on schedule for tonight's launch of the shuttle Discovery and 7 astronauts.
Occupational hazard.
The astronaut pilot of this research vehicle landed safely.
In part, this was due to the experimental nature of the technology. What might have seemed to be a good idea at the time turned out to be a dead donkey when put to the test.
But we learned from our failures, corrected the faults, and continued the work to be done.
It might seem a wasteful and extravagant way of learning. The reality is that this is what has to happen when you're working on the frontiers of new technology. Generally, the long-term benefits far outweigh the inconvenience or embarrassment of failure. Europa failures were so frequent for ELDO that a permanent range recovery and recuperation team was kept on standby for each launch. Equipped with a small helicopter, they would hop across the Australian outback to search for the broken remnants of the rocket and then patiently gather up the shattered pieces. So powerful were the explosions that ripped Europa apart that the search could cover hundreds of square kilometers. Somewhere in the tangled metal would be the key to what had gone wrong. It required considerable engineering knowledge to know what to look for. Out of thousands of different components, the difference between success and failure may be something very small and deceptively insignificant. It was not a great deal of fun, but the team always put a brave face on things and would willingly pose for an amateur team photo from time to time. Memories of disaster. Some 30 years later, on the 5th of June 1996, a new generation of European engineers were learning the same lessons all over again. They were ill-equipped for the task and had hastily recruited the French Foreign Legion to help them wade through the snake and alligator-infested mangrove swamps of French Guiana. Somewhere along the road to disaster, the first law of spaceflight had been forgotten. Always expect the unexpected. The runaway success of Ariane over the preceding years seemed to have fooled everyone. Over the course of more than 90 launches, Ariane had experienced only 5 failures. Its record for reliability was quite exceptional. This had kept insurance premiums relatively low and given satellite owners and operators a great deal of confidence. Although Ariane 5 had begun as a political gesture in order to support strong French interest in the development of the European spaceplane called Hermes, its commercial potential was formidable. Communication satellites, particularly the new generation of multi-channel digital birds, were becoming very large and heavy machines. Once again, Ariane seemed capable of cornering a dynamic new market with a rocket that was so powerful that it was capable of flying payloads all the way to the moon. For sheer brute power, it rivaled the massive Saturn V that had sent US astronauts to the lunar surface. It was also a surprisingly simple design. A huge cryogenic main tank formed the core of Ariane 5. This was big enough to drive a car inside. It was designed to hold 155 tons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, which, when combined, gave the rocket extraordinary power over a long and sustained burn. The thrust was provided by an enormous new Viking engine, in which the fuels were mixed and then ignited. New engines always worry engineers because of their sheer complexity and exceptionally fine tolerances. No component could be allowed to fail. Over and over again, ESA tested the Viking engine. Each test produced mountains of data and was intended to expose every single weakness. Unlike all the other Ariane designs, Ariane 5 was built around a single Viking engine. This had been calculated to reduce the risks of failure by cutting the number of motors that could go wrong. But the dependence upon one engine meant that there was no margin for design failure, no redundancy. The stresses on the engine during launch would be horrific. It would be shaken and twisted at very high temperatures. On either side of the main tank were two solid fuel motors. Solid fuel was perhaps the wrong name. These were controlled explosive devices, rocket bombs. Once ignited, nothing could stop them. If anything went wrong, there was nothing that could be done. This was what had destroyed NASA's Challenger space shuttle. However, it was these rocket bombs that were designed to get the Ariane 5 off the ground, accelerating it from a standing start to 1,000 kilometers an hour in a mind-boggling 30 seconds. Because they were so dangerous, they had to be assembled and packed with the explosive fuel in a building complex as far away from anywhere else as possible. Once ready, they would be carefully moved to the Ariane 5 integration building and placed alongside the main body of the rocket. This enormous structure was packed with gantries, platforms and lifts so that the thousands of skilled workers could move easily around the massive rocket. This would be the very first test flight. They were determined to leave nothing to chance. To prepare for the arrival of the new Ariane 5, ESA had to develop a completely new launch complex to run alongside the existing Ariane 4 operation. The agency had begun work in the late 1980s, carving gigantic rocket exhaust vents out of the jungle and deep into the bedrock. From a satellite image, it's clear that the Ariane spaceport sits on the coast of French Guiana. The reason for this is safety. If something goes wrong, it will generally happen over the sea. The size of the new launch site was staggering. From one side to another, it was roughly the same as the entire city of Paris. To show how it all fitted together and was meant to work, the European Space Agency put the entire structure inside a computer and produced an exquisite description of what was now known as ELA 3, a French acronym for Ensemble de Lancement d'Ariane. The principle of the operation was relatively simple. From the main integration building, Ariane 5 was to be mounted on a massive launch platform. What made the platform different was that Ariane 5 would be launched from it. In reality, it was a mobile launch site that carried everything with it that the rocket would need to get off the ground and up into space. This followed a 2-kilometer railroad that had been specially built on 2 parallel tracks leading from the main integration building. The various buildings around ELA 3 were widely dispersed, mainly for security reasons. Each of these were large, separate installations for building and assembling the different elements that made up the entire rocket. It was sited next to the Ariane 4 launch site, called ELA 2, and this was in more or less continuous use. Ariane 5 itself would be launched on the edge of the huge complex. 4 large towers protruded from the end of the railway track, and these were lightning conductors. French Guiana receives some 5 meters of rain a year, and tropical storms are not unusual. For safety reasons, Ariane 5 had to be protected against nature. In the event, it would not be anything natural that threatened the launcher. To get into space, the rocket's motors have to push against something, and this is the ground. But the exhausts from the engines have to be got rid of. The hot gases blast through the platform and into a massive chamber below. There, they're diverted back up and out through 2 exhaust vents. An umbilical tower connects the rocket to its fuel supply and to the Launch Control Center. Finally, on top of all of this, sit the satellites. The satellites scheduled for the first test flight of Ariane 5 were a set of 4 scientific research probes called Cluster. Early in 1996, they were transported to the German port of Hamburg to be shipped across the Atlantic to French Guiana. These spacecraft had taken years of patient work to design and construct. They were intended to study the solar wind pouring off the surface of the Sun and measure what happened to it when it crashed into the magnetic field surrounding the Earth. Because the scientists wanted to see this interaction between the Sun and the Earth in 3 dimensions, there were 4 identical satellites. In the gleaming new Launch Control Center, especially built for Ariane 5, preparations were well underway for the June the 4th launch. There were large video walls and galleries for spectators, the press and VIPs. Ariane 5 differed from the rest of the Ariane family of rockets in one way that would prove fatal. It carried and relied upon the electronics of the 1990s. It was highly computerized, and indeed the entire launch sequence was fully automatic. For those who could trace their careers back to the Australian outback, Eldo and Europa, there was a strange sense of déjà vu. Somehow, they'd been here before. The day started well enough, although the skies were overcast and the forecast predicted squalls of rain. There had already been various delays over the preceding weeks for one reason or another. On the morning of the 3rd of June 1996, the tug was connected to the mobile launch platform. Despite the importance of the event, there was a relaxed atmosphere. Hundreds of journalists had been flown to French Guiana to witness the next chapter of the Ariane success story, much as had happened with the first and last launch of Europa 25 years earlier. The colossal machine rolled forward on its ponderous journey towards the launch site. The rain started to fall again. The launch controllers were worried by this. Rain did not preclude a successful launch, but there was always the risk of a lightning strike in mid-flight. Nevertheless, it was an impressive sight. Helicopters buzzed around the scene, keeping a watchful eye on everything and gathering background material for television news. The flight had been named 501, the first of the Ariane 5s. Such was the confidence in the design and performance of the untried rocket that commercial customers were already booking passages for their satellites. Its designers had felt confident enough to announce that Ariane 5 would have a reliability of 99.5%. Expect the unexpected? No, that was the prediction. That was a reflection of their confidence. Yet there were concerns about the complexity of the software installed on board Ariane 5. In terms of software engineering, it was the most sophisticated rocket in the business. Not even the shuttle, with its fearsome reputation for high technology, compared with Ariane 5. Unlike large Viking motors, software was a virtually invisible component. It could be tested over and over again, but as any PC user knows, computer software is predictable only in the sense that it crashes unexpectedly. None of these reservations were going to stop the launch. The entire structure inched its way into position. Once there, Ariane 5 engineers would work through the night to ready the rocket for flight. This process is a long and involved check and counter-check routine. The platform has to be verified for levels, fuel connections made, power supplies put in place, communications to the launch control computers established. By the early hours of the morning of the 4th of June, Ariane 5 stood proudly on ELA 3, waiting for the final countdown. No one would sleep much that night. They never did before any launch. The skies opened again, and the tropical rain poured down over the rocket. There were doubts if it would be able to launch the next day. Its prospects looked poor. By the next morning, the forecast had improved slightly. A final decision to go was taken.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, unité, feu. Allumage. Décollage. Tous les paramètres propulsifs sont normaux et la trajectoire est normale.
37 seconds into the launch, the onboard computers decided 501 was 90 degrees off course. They made an automatic adjustment to the trajectory as the rocket was traveling at the speed of sound. A well-rehearsed civil defense evacuation began immediately as clouds of toxic fumes enveloped the surrounding area.
Non, non, monsieur, tout droit, tout droit, tout droit, tout droit, monsieur. Non, 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 tout droit, tout droit. Vous allez tout droit, monsieur, il y a un nuage toxique qui arrive, alors circulez.
The ghosts of Europa had returned to haunt the tigers in the jungle. The recuperation and recovery teams were back in action again. The mighty Ariane 5 had been blown to pieces by faulty computer software. There would be a board of inquiry and recriminations, the learning curve. A cruel cartoon in an English Sunday newspaper said it all. The loss of Ariane 5 on its maiden flight was a bitter disappointment, most especially for the many scientists who'd worked so hard on the 4 cluster satellites. Forgotten in the fireball that became Ariane Flight 501 were the years of research and patient engineering that go into delicate and intricate scientific research satellites. Each machine is hand-built from scratch. Sometimes this means that kilo for kilo, these satellites would cost less made out of solid gold. But the greatest loss is inevitably the rich scientific harvest they were designed to produce. Cluster and its ambitious scientific mission were consigned to oblivion. Yet success is often born out of failure. The potential of Ariane 5 remains unchallenged. Most significantly, enough power to return to the moon. But why bother? Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon for the first time on the 20th of July 1969. There were 6 other flights to the moon, all of which were successful, with the notable exception of Apollo 13. The Apollo missions were designed to do 2 things: get the astronauts there and then get them back again, safely.
60 seconds. 40 feet. 3 feet per second. 30. 3 feet per second. Looking great. 20 feet. 10. 3 feet per second. Contact now. 2, stop. Auto. This one is a long one.
Apart from Apollo 13, which never made it to the surface of the moon, all of these missions succeeded. Along the way, the astronauts collected rock samples and left scientific instruments on the surface.
This one is a long one.
These include lasers, particle detectors, and instruments designed to measure seismic activity.
This one is a long one.
Significantly, these showed that the moon was remarkably stable.
Gas engine is armed. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have ignition. What a liftoff. And liftoff.
Going back to the moon with Ariane 5 to do the same thing is not what interests European scientists. No one can follow in the footsteps of Neil Armstrong. But the moon has no atmosphere, and the Earth does. Not only is the atmosphere a natural barrier for observatories, but the rising levels of light pollution around the planet Earth make looking into the depths of the universe harder and harder from the ground. Going into space to do this, as the Hubble Space Telescope has, is one solution, but this comes with a very high price tag. Observatories on the very stable moon would actually cost less, last longer, and see further, argued the European scientists. The argument against this was equally persuasive. Eventually, it would involve sending astronauts to the moon for weeks and probably months. Human beings need water as well as air. That means transporting tons and tons of equipment to the moon just to keep people alive. A perfectly reasonable argument.
Apollo 14, this is Houston. Your go for the docking. Roger, we got you. Okay, we captured.
When astronomers first started looking at the moon with simple telescopes, they could see light and dark areas. It seemed reasonable at the time to assume that the dark regions were oceans and the light areas land. As they began to produce maps of the moon, the dark areas were given names, such as the Sea of Imbrium.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition.
By the time the explorers of the 20th century had reached the lunar surface, it was clear that these seas were nothing more than dry, dusty deserts. Water on the moon was just a fantasy of light. At the end of 1996, scientists using an American spacecraft called Clementine got a shock. Deep inside a huge crater called the Atkin Basin, they found the unmistakable signs of large volumes of water. They could only assume that this had been deposited by collisions between icy comets and the moon. But water is water, and this would make a human colony possible. Coupled to the powerful new Ariane 5, the temptation to fly to the moon may be hard to resist. The scientific benefits are huge, and the technologies to get there already exist. It would be the ultimate triumph for the tigers in the jungle. There are many unexplored facets of the moon. many strange phenomena. What caused this odd series of geological depressions? How was this peculiar rift valley formed? Is it a tectonic fault line? Why is the basin of this huge crater jet black? Human settlements on the Moon may not be so far-fetched. A Eurostar train sweeps through the green fields